We are now in a break in the Frank Bybee trial, but don't turn away because we have a special segment for you right now. As many of you know, there was a horrific shooting in Las Vegas the other day, and a lot of people are trying to make sense of this chaotic event, this tragic event, many questions about the shooter, the victims, trying to piece together what happened with this event that changed the lives of many families. It changed the nation, and we're trying to make sense of everything right now. So to help us understand a little bit about the crime scene, which is a big question that's been brought up, we are lucky to have with us right now Joseph Scott Morgan. He's a distinguished scholar of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us here again on the Law News Network.
It's great to be back with my friends at LawNewz. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, a lot to talk about here. I want to start from the beginning. We talked in the middle of the break. You sent me some pictures about the crime scene, the aerial view of the entire area where this shooting took place. Let's start more from the beginning. What goes into processing this kind of evidence for such a large crime scene? We're talking about over 59 people dead, over 500 injured, a gigantic area. What goes into processing that kind of crime scene?
It's hard for people that have never been at a crime scene this vast, and there's not too many people that have, particularly in the U.S. It's hard to fathom because it is the geographic area that this thing covers. The only thing that really kind of, to put it in perspective for people that are out there that might not fully comprehend, the only thing I could really compare it to would be like a small plane crash, because you've got these particulate pieces of evidence, and even the most minute thing can paint a tremendous picture relative to what was going on during these events. It's a large open area, and there's not too many places for concealment and cover. From a forensics perspective, it kind of opens up everything where you can see it. Let me take you back in time a little bit. Cases that I've worked in the past where we've had multiple fatalities like this, it really taxes the ability of investigators, and you literally have to break up into teams in order to process individual sectors. And to make
I think, all right.
You've got all of these bits of evidence, and so it's problematic, to say the very least.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about this crime scene in terms of over 500 people were injured, 59 people are dead. When you have this many injuries and fatalities, victims in general, is it the proper protocol? Do you have to do a careful forensic analysis of each one of those victims to determine what happened, how it happened, the impact of injury? I can imagine that's a tremendous undertaking for the investigators in this case.
Yeah, it is, and it goes to this idea of sequencing, and this has been something that has resonated throughout the investigation. You've heard the media talking about it. This idea of actually what kind of timeline are we looking at in the immediate? First off, where did the initial burst take place? Where were they directed? Was he targeting a specific area? And then how did this kind of migration of fire take place? Just to put it in perspective, this guy is in a position, almost an eagle eye view, where he's over 300 feet in the air, lingering, hovering over approximately 22,000 people. There's been a lot of hay made over the fact that he had scoped weapons. Jesse, you don't need a scope when you have that large of an area. So you begin to look at things like distribution of spent brass casings from these weapons.
Oh, I think we might have just caught off of Joe.
The caliber, and not just the caliber that he had in the room, but what kind of spent rounds, projectiles are you recovering at the scene, and trying to pair those up with the actual weapon that fired them. And it's logistically it's very taxing. Intellectually, it's taxing for the forensics people because there's so many tiebacks here. And you want to get the sequencing right. You want to get the marrying up of the evidence correct, and really try to paint a picture for the courts. And people raise an eyebrow at that when you say the courts. As you well know as an attorney, you have no idea where this is going to go. We're very early in these stages. Then the general public needs to know. I think people need to try to begin to understand this, because this is by far the most horrific event involving firearms in U.S. history. Outside of, I don't even know what we would compare it to in our distant past. It really resonates with me as an investigator, the responsibility that we have to kind of paint this picture, because as sad as it is, it's a historic moment, and we have to make sure that we get all of these details correct moving forward.
Yeah, it's the worst mass shooting that we had in modern times. We all hope that it's the last mass shooting. I mean, it's unspeakable what this man did, and everyone, like you said, is trying to understand why this happened. So the million-dollar question becomes, and I think you touched upon it a little bit, depending upon his rate of fire, the bullets that were used, the weapons that were used, the angle that he shot, does it give you some sort of indication? I know it's not an easy question. Does this give some sort of indication about what his motive was? In other words, if he's firing at a specific group of people, if he's firing randomly, if he's firing, I know that it just came out recently that I think he was firing for 9 to 11 minutes. That includes reload time, where he was aiming. Was he just shooting anybody that he saw? Why did he target this concert in particular? From a forensic standpoint, you're trying to understand exactly how people were injured and how they were killed. But from another standpoint, you're trying to understand, why did the shooter do this particular way? Why did he shoot? Why did he use these kind of guns? I think he had 23 guns in his room. How many guns he actually used, how many he was planning to use. Can you speak a little bit more about trying to get into the mind of this shooter based upon the evidence? Joseph?
Yeah, I will do my best.
Yeah.
And
sorry, I think we lost you for a minute.
Just from Jump Street, this is my takeaway. This is a highly...
Joseph, I'm sorry, I think we keep cutting in and out here. Do you mind just repeating a little bit what you said for our viewers? Sure. I think we're just cutting a little bit in and out.
That's okay. This is a very well-planned event. This guy took his time over a 4-day period, and I think he was probably assessing the area way before this. And I'm going to go into detail on this a little bit. But let's just keep in mind what kind of weapons and ammunition load we're talking about. You're talking about someone that transported or delivered close to in excess of 500 pounds of firearms into this hotel. Okay, he was purposed in doing this. Thousands of rounds of ammunition, magazines, any other kind of devices that would help him facilitate this event. And he chose, and I'm still unclear about this. I want to know if he specifically requested this room. My assumption is yes. He chose a perfect place. For people that have not been to Vegas, this is a horrible perfect storm. McCarran Airport is immediately behind this place. You've got ambient noise from that. He knew that there was a concert. The direction in which he is firing is literally the direction in which the sound is traveling out. And he is in a highly placed position, so that the normal person, when they hear gunfire, they look to their left and their right. Most people do not throw their head upward to cast their vision in that direction. There's a huge video board to the left aspect of the stage that, if you've ever been to an outdoor concert, this is eye candy. It's dazzling the people. They're transfixed. And then you have people talking and milling about. and not to mention all of the noise that's traveling out that's blasting them. There are countless reports of people being totally disoriented in this. And this goes to this idea that he wanted, in military terms, and you've heard people throwing this out many times, he wanted a kill box, a specific area where he has people captured in a location that has fencing on one side. You've got dangerous area that is so lethal that it doesn't require a lot of marksmanship to facilitate this, but what it does require is a lot of planning. He's got platforms that are up there, and let's just talk about the weapons just for a second from what we know thus far. He's got 223, which is also in military terms, NATO round, is a 5.56 millimeter. It's .223 caliber. That's the civilian version. That's roughly what we look at when we see our troops overseas and they're carrying an M4. It's based on the old M16 platform. He's got those. He's got AR-10 platform, which is much bulkier round. This is set up for a 308 civilian caliber, which is the military version of this is 7.62 millimeter. People have heard 9, which is a little bit different. He had these weapons preloaded, Jesse, with 2 windows that are knocked out some distance from one another. The hammer is on the floor. You can see that this was most likely used to facilitate the destruction of this window, which I know that you've been to Vegas before. Mm-hmm. A lot of us have. Wind always blows there. And at the altitude he's at, and this is altitude, winds are very strong. These windows actually have to be kind of hurricane grade type windows where they can sustain, these blasts of wind. He had to knock these things out. As he has these 2 platforms set up, pitching downward like this, and that he's got stabilizers on them like unipods or bipods. I think we're going to find out a lot more about the equipment as time goes by. He can go, let's say he starts at the far side of the hotel. As he begins to fire down at the crowd, he's hitting people on the left aspect. As they begin to migrate, and I'm just spitballing here, but as they begin to migrate, he walks down roughly, you figure each window pane is like, I don't know, a yard in width, maybe a little bit bigger. He walks down in the image, it looks like almost 6 yards, 18 feet to his right. There's another window knocked out. He gets a completely different perspective at that time. He's got these multiple weapon platforms laid out, and so he's firing down like this. He can take them out concentrically like this, or he can go peripherally like this. And there's nowhere for you to go. That's what makes this so horrible. Here's another thing. In all of these classes that people tell you, you hear it goes out to the general public, and I'm not saying it's bad information, but a lot of people say in the event that something like this happens, you need to lay down and play dead. This is the worst thing you could have done in this position. And amazingly, a lot of people instinctively went to the ground. Well, when you go to the ground, if you don't curl up, which most people don't, they go prone and spread. You increase surface area by spreading out, and there's all kinds of opportunities for these rounds to begin to strike the body. Not only are you talking about the rounds themselves, you're talking about any other kind of debris that's being kicked up that becomes shrapnel. And as horrible as this is, I've worked cases before where bone is dislodged from one person and actually becomes shrapnel into somebody else's body.
Oh my God.
When you're talking about supersonic rounds, which these are, I don't know that this happened. I'm just saying that potential happens. Any kind of medium that this thing passes through, it fragments many times, and it creates this kind of lead storm. So I'm talking about this, and I don't have, I'm not the one that has to work it. I can sense though the
So in other words, what you're saying is it's possible, Joseph, that what you see is we have over 500 people injured. That
yeah,
might not necessarily be each one was struck by a bullet.
right,
They might have
very
had
sure,
shrapnel, they might have tripped over, they might have been injured in other ways as a result of this attack, but not necessarily, even though we'll see the results later on, not necessarily each one was struck with a bullet.
yeah, yeah, that's not the case, and it's not beyond the pale to think, when people get panicked, and you're talking about a crowd of 22,000 people, Jesse, roughly, that's the number I've heard. Um, What about trampling? People being
Yeah.
knocked down, people tripping over one another, and think about the demographic of this audience. This is kind of a family event. Yeah, I mean it's Vegas, but you have people that were there with children. You also had older people. Now we don't know anything about diagnoses at this point.
Right. Speaking about the shooter in this point and the victims, it's interesting. You mentioned a good point, Joseph. I want to talk about it. I want to actually just talk about this one point. The idea that he was so many stories up and he was firing into the crowd. From all we can tell, he's had no military training. He's fired guns before. That's a difficult shot to fire from such a high altitude with the wind conditions. As you know, we've been to Vegas. The wind blows very strong from those high altitudes. In a way, does that show that the bullets maybe sprayed? Maybe he was aiming at a certain place and the bullets sprayed from where he initially tried to target? Or is this a
Yeah,
guy? I mean, what can you speak to that kind of shot? It's a difficult shot to make.
it is. It is if we're talking about the Kennedy assassination,
Yeah.
where you've got a moving target. You've got, I'm not going to say a static target, but it's almost like it's.
I think we might have cut out a little bit again. Just waiting to hear
Hit,
back
you're
from
going
Joseph.
to hit
Yeah.
rock. When you have people spread out over all this area, it doesn't take a tremendous amount of skill. And it's, and I urge people to take a look at some of the images that they're seeing from this elevated position. And I think folks can begin to understand how tightly packed it is. It reminds me of, when I was still with the ME's office back in the 90s and 96, we worked the Olympic Park bombing. Now that went a lot, it was bad, but it went a lot better than it could have. That was a tightly packed area. You had people running all over the place. And it was dense. It's a dense swath of humanity that he's firing into. And a lot of people, I don't know that they've gotten the full depth and breadth of this yet. It's not like he was, and I can't speak to his motive or his specific targeting, but it doesn't seem like he's targeting one person, but he's targeting the group. And he's got this bump, which is a stock bump, that's apparently present on several of these weapons. It's an aftermarket thing that's easily accessible, and it's not, just so that people in the audience understand, this stock bump, as it's referred to, is not the same um, as a automatic weapon in the sense that it was done at the factory. This is something that's attached to the stock so that as you tug it into your shoulder, it facilitates through the kinetic energy to keep the weapon cycling. Okay, it's not quite as smooth as something that has been created in the factory at one of these companies that makes firearms like this. Um, but you can still, if I can just for a second tell you, when I got an alert on my phone the other night when all of this happened, Jesse, I climbed up through the haze of sleep and I clicked on the thing that said raw footage, and I had the perspective that a lot of people did, where you're looking at the rear, from the rear toward the stage, and I could hear the report. And the first thing that came to mind, because I'm a veteran, it sounded like a crew served belt fed weapon. Like we think a saw or an M60 machine gun that has a belt that goes through it. It's pop, 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 pop. And there was no ceasing with it. And I had to kind of shake myself and say, my God, do we have somebody with a belt fed weapon in Vegas? And as it turned out, no, he didn't. What he had was multiple weapon platforms with this stock bump that could still facilitate it. And keep in mind, some of these magazines that they're recovering up there, from what I understand at this point, you're talking about 60 round magazines. And I understand he even had a drum clip or a drum mag also that can hold, over 100 rounds in some cases. The only thing that's really stopping this guy, um, that where he's having to give pause, well, there's a couple of things. Smoke that's in the enclosed area that he's in because it's being generated by the weapons being fired, and also the heating of barrels. But he's got that problem covered as well because all he has to do is migrate to another weapon, change his position. And this way, he keeps any kind of targets that may have sensed that they're being fired at from.
Right. And you know what's interesting? We talk about all the different weapons that he had, Joseph. The idea,
I can't. I
the
honestly cannot believe. And
right.
last thing, I honestly cannot believe we don't have more immediate fatalities at this moment in time. I really
Right.
can't.
You know what's interesting? When you look at the amount of weapons that he had and the type of weapons, I wonder if a question becomes, was this a guy who initially planned, as he said, as he did, to fire into this crowd, but then take on the police? I don't know if he had short-range weapons with him where he encountered or he anticipated some sort of gunfight, a near-range gunfight. In the end, he took his own life. But it would be curious to see whether or not he had so many weapons with him. Were they all planned to be used from that high range, or was he trying to anticipate a short gunfight as well?
I don't know, Jesse. That's a great question. From what I understand, and again, these numbers continue to change. It's fluid. All right, everything is fluid at this point. As over all these years, I've covered cases like this. These things just kind of take on a life of their own. What I had initially heard is that he had one handgun with him, and that's kind of a close quarters weapon that you generally associate, in a tight space like this. Um, but if he's got an M4, which if the folks at home can easily reference that, or an AR-15, let's put it in parlance that they're using right now, an AR-15 platform. Some of these have rather short muzzles, so they're easy to maneuver. I mean, our troops use them going house to house in the Middle East right now, and so in Iraq and in Afghanistan and where else we're engaged. And so they're used to go in, but they can also be used at great distances. Both of these, both of these weapons platforms that I'm talking about, the 5.56, which is the AR-15, and the 308 AR-10, both of these have an effective range of out to 1,000 yards. All right, so you you begin to put that in perspective with the amount of ammunition he had, the amount of platforms he had, and the kill box, which is not 1,000 yards away. It's well within the effective lethality of these weapons, and it's a very dangerous mix.
Let me ask you something. If we know, as you said before, he broke the windows with a hammer, it's clear if you look up from the Mandalay Bay, you can see where those broken windows are. Now, I don't know if there was muzzle fire when he was firing. I don't know if it was a suppressed shot, but
Right?
I have a question for you.
Sure.
If there's been discussion about whether there's in the news right now about the use of suppressors. If in fact he did use a suppressor and he was able to suppress that muzzle fire, and he wasn't to use a hammer, and he was able to create an opening in the windows to fire through, would you have anticipated a much greater casualties, much greater fatalities? Because in other words, you don't know where the shots are coming from, as you said. You said most people would hear left or right. They don't think to look up. Now,
No,
if
they
you're
don't.
using a suppressed fire, didn't break the windows, you've created an opening. How much worse would that have been?
It could have potentially been catastrophic because once Aldine stopped singing, the only thing that was still going on, other than planes coming and going in McCarran, was the sound of those reports of that weapon. And you can distinctly hear it on the tape. Yeah, it could have been. it could have been far more devastating. The only compromise that you get, and I'm getting off into the academic weeds here a bit, but the only compromise that you get relative to a suppressor is that you lose some muzzle velocity. But still, that's negligible with this type of weapon and what you're attempting to do with it. You're not going for precision act.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I know. He was firing into a crowd, and it wasn't like he was just aiming at a few distinct
And that's
targets.
what happened.
Right. Joseph, I do have a question for you. You spoke about it a little bit before. God forbid anything like this ever happens again, or people are in this kind of situation where you have an open arena area. You said the worst thing you could do is be on the ground and spread your body out, because that does create a more mass area. If you are in an open situation, you hear gunfire, is the best thing for you to do, based upon your analysis of crime scenes, the people who are able to survive these events, or at least come out with less severe injuries, do you try to jump into a tent somewhere where there's not an open area where you won't be seen? Is there any way to avoid being in that open area? What, for people who are in there, what do you try to do? Do you just try to seek, I know it says seek cover, but what does
Yeah,
that mean exactly?
yeah. Cover is relative. When you're, when you're, I'll tell you a good thing for people to take a look at, and it'll give you some kind of idea. If you go back to the North Hollywood robbery, there's actually a pretty good little movie that came out a few years ago about that. Um, you see the police in those positions, those defensive positions that they're in, and it consistently they demonstrate. And Hollywood actually did a pretty good job with this. They're demonstrating those police officers in that movie as being behind the engine block of the car. If you're on the same plane as an individual, that's really perfect. However, nobody, and I mean nobody, anticipates, other than people outside of the military, when you have these folks that go out and give speeches to public about safety and all this sort of thing. Nobody anticipates somebody firing from an elevated platform like this.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about a canvas tent, I guess that would be your first line. You're obscured. He's not. You're not going to be in the shooter's line of sight at that point. But still, uh, these bullets, that it would be like wet tissue paper for a canvas tent. The next thing you can do is, first off, get out of the line of sight as quickly as you can. Don't lay down. That's horrible. Move. You got to move. It's the idea of being a moving target is very, very difficult uh, to overcome for a shooter. Maybe not a skilled shooter, but again, you got such a mass of humanity here, Jesse. He could just randomly fire, and he's going to hit something.
Yeah.
You need to be in a solid fixed place. I've worked cases before where, um, I've had people that have been killed when projectiles pass through the roofs of buildings that the person was not necessarily the intended target. Um, and that's with a high velocity round. So unless you're in some kind of, encasement, the best thing you can do is just try to get out of the line of fire. The problem is, particularly with this case, how are you going to know that you're even in the line of fire, because he's at such an elevated position and nobody had a frame of reference for it?
I know. There was no warning sign. It just
Yeah,
happened, and no one expected this to happen.
no.
I wonder what, in your opinion, you've seen crime scenes like this. You're looking at this one. Moving forward, is the idea of open concert venues where it's surrounded by buildings probably not going to happen? Is there a way for hotels or buildings, do you reinforce the glass in a way where it's not so easily breakable? Do you put a sensor on the buildings so that as soon as a window breaks, you're alerted? I mean, let's not forget, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mandalay Bay found out about this because there was smoke in the room from the gunfire, and it set off the alarm. No one would have
Yeah,
known otherwise. I mean, what do we do moving forward in terms of safety precautions?
I have. I'm dumbfounded. I'm not a safety guy. I can only look at it from a forensic standpoint. But of course, I know I've been able to assess things long enough in my career to be able to say, well, if they had been here, they wouldn't have died in this position. Going back to the Olympic Park bombing, the one fatality that we had out there, regarding the blast itself. Now, we had one person, and you find this interesting as an attorney, one person, we had two homicides. They were charged with two homicides. One of the people out there died as a result of a heart attack, and they charged Rudolph with that case as well. But the lady that died from the blast, she was standing adjacent to a sculpture that was out there. And the sculpture, Jesse, looked like someone had taken buckshot and fired multiple times at this thing. If she had just moved a little to her left, she'd probably still be with us at this point. So you, it's hard to say, Pete, you're not going to stop people from going to concerts. And I don't know. It's the question is so vast and overwhelming. I don't know how hotels, sporting venues. I don't know how you would begin to even wrap your mind around how to go about this. And this goes to a bigger thing, doesn't it? I've heard people throw up the word terrorism throughout this entire conversation that we've been having now for several days. And to my way of thinking, maybe it's not domestic terrorism, maybe it's not international terrorism, but people are terrorized nonetheless. And as a dad, as a husband, I have terror in my heart right now, and people say you can't be afraid and you can't let them win. But that's all fine and good. It's coffee house talk, is what it comes down to. When you begin to think about your personal safety and those of your family, do you want to risk it? Do you want to go out there? And that's going to be an ongoing conversation with us. And we begin to look at all of the things that we do. I mean, let's think about in our society, all the things that we do that are a big deal. My God, just think about Times Square on New Year's Eve, man. I mean, how many people can you pack into a tight area? And they always try to secure people and tell everybody, well, we're safe. We're safe. Well, I'm sure the people at the Jason Aldean concert thought they were safe. Mm-hmm. Could the police have predicted this? No, I don't believe they could have. Could Mandalay Bay have predicted this? Probably not. But, when you say that they didn't get an alert on this thing until smoke detectors started going on, and now there's even a word floating around the wind that's saying that security cameras had been disabled on this floor. And the guy had external cameras that he had set up on his own to see the approach of the police officers in the hallway. This thing's mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling.
Let's not forget this guy was a Vegas local. He was an extravagant gambler. He had for anybody who's been to Vegas, that room, as you said, Joe, that room is facing the Strip. That is prime real estate when you're trying to get a room at the Mandalay Bay. He was an expensive gambler. I don't know if his room was comped or not, but this is a guy who knew all the passageways, knew about the hotel, knew about Vegas, knew about the concert, probably requested that room. It was all of the worst things that could happen, all combining together to create the worst mass shooting that we've seen in modern times. And, it's funny, as you said, we prevent people from going to venues who go into the venues. There are metal detectors. There are ways to prevent people from entering with weapons. You're worried about the crowd. What you don't anticipate is someone in the exterior perimeter, someone who's outside the concert, outside of a venue. What prevents from that happening, from attacking from the outside in? And there was no way to prevent this. And right now it's up to investigators and crime scene analysts to make sense of this. And what you said about terrorism, the most eerie part about this is we still don't know why he did this. We'll interview people that knew him, try to understand. What we've heard so far is everybody's been surprised. They can't understand it. Yes, he's had family members. His father was a convicted armed robber. He had gambling debts. He was a big gambler, things like that, but doesn't explain why he would do this. Now, what we talked about at the beginning was trying to make sense of what we do know, the facts, the evidence, the forensics, the crime scene, try to understand his rate of fire. And you presented some interesting ideas about why the difficulties it will be for analyzing this crime scene. I wonder, for something like this, months, weeks, till we get some sort of understanding about how many casings, how many bullets, how people are injured. What do you suspect we'll get more answers by? How long does it take to process this crime scene?
A while. And this is going to come out in a few parts, Jesse, and I can just kind of briefly run these down to the audience and kind of lay this out. First off, what's going to be and again, I hate to keep using the term historic, or it's more like a benchmark for us in forensics. I don't recall any case like this over the course of my career where we've had this much gunfire from an elevated position, where they're going to have to shoot trajectories to try to determine the pitch of the rounds, the trajectory of the rounds that as they were impacting downrange. This is going to be very intriguing to watch. There will be animation, I would imagine, that will be generated as to this. I think that the public will be curious to see this. I know that as a practitioner, a former practitioner, and a professor now, I'll be very curious to see it. My hat's off to him because I don't, I can't. The scope of it again is kind of mind-boggling. We have that piece, and then there's going to be the analyzation of the actual physical evidence that we're recovering at the scenes. And keep in mind, we've got multiple weapons platforms. I keep saying that, but for every weapon platform, the round that comes out of the end of that barrel is going to have a ballistic signature to it. The idea is that we're going to have to, they are going to have to marry up those projectiles that they can recover back to the individual weapon which generated that projectile. Also the casings, they're going to have extraction marks. These are semi-automatic rounds. They're being pulled out and they leave distinctive markings. Then it comes the really tough stuff. We're going to learn a lot from the deceased. That's kind of the area where I dance, and in medical legal death investigation, these poor victims, the deceased, will give up their information in the autopsy suite. I've had several people over the last few days saying, and you get this all the time: shooter's dead. Why do you have to do an autopsy? It's requisite in almost every state that I know of, that if there is a homicide that has been committed, the bodies are at least going to have to, at a minimum, have an external examination and toxicology drawn. In this case, I'm assuming that every one of these people will be autopsied and thoroughly examined, and this is an overwhelming task. Vegas, Clark County has got a wonderful coroner's facility and personnel. They're going to have to do this and try to extract as much information from the bodies as they can to paint the picture of how these people specifically died. Find out if these are the actual rounds that pass through the body, if it's a ricochet, how many times maybe some people were hit more than once, were these trampling incidences, blunt force, was it a heart attack? And finally, that brings us to the shooter. I want to know, first off, what his specific cause of death was. Everybody keeps saying he was shot, he was shot. I don't doubt that he was shot. I want to know if it's consistent with a suicide. And let's go back again in time. I love history. Let's go back 1966 with Charles Whitman at the University of Texas and review the mistake that they made there. When Whitman's body was finally autopsied, and that was after he had been embalmed, they were not able to draw toxicology on him. So we don't know what was.
So in other words, what you're saying, Joseph, is you have to analyze the body of the shooter in this case to understand Stephen Paddock. You have to analyze his body. You have to do a forensic analysis of his body, understand the cause of death, just to rule out the possibility of what was in his system that day. How was he shot? Because I know there are people out there who are questioning whether or not this guy was acting alone. Was he the shooter, in fact? I know there's people that are questioning because he has no clear motive. So in other words, you have to see exactly how he was shot. To add to what you're about to say with him, because we got cut off on that, that's why I'm just interrupting.
No, that's fine.
Just to add up to this, do you analyze the hotel room for other people's DNA? Obviously, this is a hotel room. There's people that stay there. But is there a way to tell who had been in the room in the general time frame before this happened? Is there a way that DNA stays longer than other DNA? And if you can pinpoint that someone was in the room a short time before this happened or the same time he was there, that's somebody you want to question and understand what they saw and heard.
Yeah, I'm going to want to talk to everybody that crossed that threshold after this guy got the room. And with that said, I'm going to want to know what their activity was in that room, where they went in that room, and I'm hoping that the crime scene people will go through the area and take random samples of just looking for potential for touch DNA. Where were their hands placed? Where were drinks placed? Where did they sit down? You'll have to get a baseline with Paddock. Uh, you know, find his DNA there. But also, I'd like to see if we could isolate any other. And yeah, I mean, there's not a database that we can go to and say, yeah, this belongs to somebody. But the key part here, from an investigative standpoint, we've got their DNA. And if something develops down the road, um, I got to tell you, the biggest thing for me is I want to know if his girlfriend's DNA is in the room right now.
Yep.
They said she's made it back to the U.S. I want to know if it's there and how it got there. Did he bring it in with him, or was she physically there?
And there's a way to determine that. In other words, you can tell if she was physically there as a way, or where we see in other cases where DNA is planted somewhere.
That's going to be very difficult to do. I think it'll be very difficult to kind of vet that and separate it out. But again, it's just a baseline of establishment here, Jesse. Can we establish that her DNA was there or anyone else's? That doesn't marry up to the hotel staff. Okay.
Right.
Is there any other DNA? Now, keep in mind, you will have had other residents in there. Okay. And so you might need to go back and question them. And I don't know how far the police want to take this. I mean, you can go back some distance. Touch DNA is very fragile. It's generally skin, slough skin samples or cells that only gives you a portion of strand that's there, but still you need to have it. Why not? Why not? Why not go back and gather every possible thing that you can?
I agree with you. And this is one of those cases that it's going to be investigated for a while. People
Yeah.
need answers. They're going to, I would hope, expend every resource possible,
Me too.
not just analyzing the crime scene, analyzing his hotel room, analyzing his house, because we really do need to understand why this happened and whether or not anybody else contributed to this crime. That's what people need to see. That's what the answers we need, both for the victims in this case, their families, and for the future. Because if there was anyone who was responsible for this besides Stephen Paddock, we need to identify them immediately.
You bet.
As we close, Joe, I just have a final question for you.
You bet.
What do you, as a expert in this field, as a father, as an American, as anybody who's affected by this crime, how do we make sense of this tragedy? How do you make sense of it, and how do we move forward from it?
I can't. I've spent quite a bit of my life trying to figure out why people do what they do, and that's why I get tired of asking the question why. And I just, from a scientific perspective, I look at how it's. There's more sanity attached to it. I've never been able in my years.
I think we might have just cut off a little bit. Joseph, are you there? Yeah.
We have to look at. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. We just cut you off a little bit.
That's okay. It's kind of ham-handed, but we have to look out for our own in this and protect our own and take a measure of safety. And this is the bottom line. And in every case that I've ever worked as far as a death investigator, I hope something is learned from it. Because if there's nothing that's learned from it, it's a waste. And this is a waste. You can explain plane crashes. You can talk about train accidents and explosions and all those sorts of things, but it's just heartbreaking. I mean, just the waste of life that this guy facilitated. It's nauseating, and that's why it's so very difficult for families to get closure with events like this. It's one thing to say, the plane fell out of the sky, or some other horrible thing, but just senseless waste of these poor people, and my heart just absolutely breaks. I could cry for days. I've heard, in my earpiece over the past few days in various media outlets, I've heard these interviews and these conversations and just listened to these stories, and it's gut wrenching, just absolutely gut wrenching. I don't know where we go. I really don't. I know that it's it continues to layer my jadedness as a former death investigator, and I guess probably as an American and an observer of life. I don't know. I think that's something that everybody's going to have to figure out for themselves.
Joseph Scott Morgan, Distinguished Scholar of Applied Forensics from Jacksonville State University. Can't thank you enough for coming on here, talking about
Pleasure.
this case. As more develops in this case, we'd love to have you on to talk more about the evidence, get more answers about this. You've been tremendous. Thank you so much, and thank you again. We'll have you on soon.
Take care.
Thank you. As we were talking about, we are covering the Vegas massacre, trying to make sense of it from any which way we can. I just want to say on behalf of the LawNewz, our whole staff, our team, we really do send our best wishes, our sympathy, our everything to the families of this senseless and horrific tragedy in Las Vegas. As I said before, Vegas is almost a second home to me. I love it there. The people, the community, it's an amazing place. And as always, everyone will rebuild, come together. It was terrible to report. We reported it a few days ago that a guest that we've had on here, Jennifer Irvine, who's been a terrific guest, she is one of the people that died in that terrible, terrible shooting. Again, our hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to her family as well as the rest of the families. And we here on LawNewz will continue to follow this case, provide more analysis, more discovery as more evidence comes out. And we thank you for joining us here.